So good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. My name is Can Kantarcı, and I'm the Communications Manager at the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our online book launch event for The Riders Come Out at Night, Brutality, Corruption, and Cover-Up in Oakland by Ali Winston and Darwin BondGraham. Columbia Global Center Istanbul is a part of a network of 9 global centers of Columbia University in New York. The centers serve as knowledge hubs that aim to educate and inspire through research, dialogue, and action, with the objective of connecting the local with the global, creating opportunities for shared learning, and deepening the nature of global dialogue. Today, we'll be listening to a conversation on The Riders Come Out at Night between Ali Winston, the co-writer of The Riders Come Out at Night, and Emre Kızılkaya, a media executive and researcher from Turkey. The Riders Come Out at Night is the culmination of over 21 years of fearless reporting. Ali Winston and Darwin BondGraham shine a light on the jackbooted police culture, lack of political will, and misguided leadership. The authors traced the history of Oakland since its inception through the lens of the city's police department, through the power raids, McCarthyism, and the civil rights struggle, the Black Panthers, and crack eras, to Oakland's present-day revival. Ali Winston is an independent reporter covering criminal justice, privacy, and surveillance. His work has been rewarded with several awards, including the George Polk Award for local reporting in 2017. Ali is a graduate of the University of Chicago and the University of California, Berkeley. Emre Kızılkaya, who worked as a journalist for 20 years, is a vice chair of the Vienna-based International Press Institute. He manages Journal, a non-profit news platform supported by Turkish Journalists Union and the EU. Kızılkaya was selected by Harvard University for Night Visiting Nieman Fellowship in 2019. Without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Emre Kızılkaya.
Thank you, John, and thank you to everyone who participates, starting from Ali and all the attendees of this session. Ali, this is a great book. First of all, congratulations for that. It has just been published, and I had the chance to read it before it's on the shelves. And it focuses on a group of sadistic cops known as the Riders. Although it is set in Oakland, California, the story is relevant in so many countries where public bodies, including the police, needs to be democratically reformed because of violations of law and democratic rights. It is also a timeless book, I believe, because the challenges and hopes of reform, as described in the book, can be observed in any time. For instance, we continue to see police breaking laws in many places, from Los Angeles to the United Kingdom. That in the past few weeks we have seen so many news stories coming from there, and also in my home country, Turkey, where police brutality in the past claimed many lives and caused to many tragedies. So let's start with the where of the where question about the book. Oakland is a typical American city in the way that New York or Los Angeles is not. And more has been done to try to reform the Oakland Police Department than any other police force in the United States. That's why it's interesting to have the scene as Oakland in this book. So, Ali, can you tell us about Oakland? Where should we put this city on the map?
Thank you, first of all, for having me here. It's a deep honor to speak about riders with you all. Oakland is a city of about 450,000 people on the shores of the Bay, the San Francisco Bay. It's on the East Bay, so San Francisco is here, the Bay Bridge is here, and it's here on the mainland. San Francisco is a peninsula. Marin is to the north. The Golden Gate is here. That's where that famous, red painted bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge is. And Oakland is over here on the mainland. It is the region's port. It's one of the 5 largest ports in the United States. So it has a long-standing blue-collar tradition, and it is quite mixed up racially. It is about 30% white, 30% Latino, 25%, a little bit less African-American. That population has been dropping. We can get into the demographic information later. And about 10% Asian, and then the remainder are Native American and so and South Asian and so on. Oakland is a relatively young city by an American standard. And also for size, most American cities are about 400, 500,000 people, a few 100,000 people. The megalopolis is like Houston and Los Angeles and Chicago are very rare. And actually, the largest city in the region is San Jose to the south, which is about 2 million people. So it's not the biggest city technically for the Bay Area, but because of where it's situated at the center of the region, it's the transportation hub. It is a big cultural hub. It basically punches above its weight for a number of reasons. But historically, Oakland is a young city. It was founded in 1852, so a little bit before state independence. Over time, it was initially kind of it existed to serve San Francisco, to provide natural resources for San Francisco, basically in the shape of the trees that once covered the hillsides here, and which give the city its name. San Francisco was really built on East Bay lumber. It remained a relatively small place until the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, which led to a huge fire that burned down much of that city across the bay. And then there was a big outmigration across the East Bay, and that's really when it started to grow. But there was also another major development here, which was the railway, the transcontinental railway in the US. The terminal point was in Oakland, which made it a very important point for shipping to and from Asia and South America, as well as intercontinental transportation. So that really drew a lot of blue collar workers here. At the same time, the city had a very strong, very powerful Anglo elite that got rich on gold mining, on selling stuff to gold miners, which obviously for California is kind of the creation myth of the state, that people were drawn out west mostly during the gold rush of 1849. That elite really controlled the city through the mid 20th century. Their role was really important because Oakland grew tremendously during the Second World War. It was a center of the war industries like Los Angeles and Portland and Seattle. And since there was a draft underway and most of the men in the city, the white Anglo or European descended men, left and were drafted out for service, there was a desperate need for workers in the war industries because they were building ships here, airplanes, there were munitions factories, tire factories, car factories, what have you. And there was a huge migration of African Americans from the South and the Southeast to the West Coast for the war industries. Los Angeles, San Diego, Portland, Oakland, San Francisco, Seattle, the African American populations here, the majority, all date from that period. As a result of that, same elite that we spoke about earlier really decided they intended to keep that population. At first, they wanted that population to be temporary and return back to the South. But when that didn't happen, they set about basically redlining neighborhoods through real estate covenants, restricting people from buying housing. And they put the police department into play to ensure that the African-American population didn't escape from those ghettos. And that led to the most famous explosion in Oakland's history, and probably one thing that marks Oakland out for an international audience. And that's the creation of the Black Panther Party in 1966, which was founded explicitly on a message of community control over the police and armed resistance to police oppression. That's a long-winded way of saying that the city is a very dynamic place. It holds a place of distinction in American history because, in this regard, in view of policing, because it reflects what happened in many other places. All these other West Coast cities I listed that expanded during the war and received this huge influx of African-American populations. They also had similar dynamics with their law enforcement agencies, but the pushback to that really began in Oakland. And in many ways, Oakland trends ahead of history in the United States with regard to law enforcement and community police relations. This is a long way of saying that an important way of saying that this is the police department I decided to focus on because it's where I was in grad school. I went to the University of California, Berkeley for a journalism degree. And I wanted to cover, this is in 2008, before Darwin and I started working together. And I decided to start covering criminal justice more intently because that was a topic of interest to me. And then you learn these bits and pieces of history bit by bit by bit as you go on. Darwin and I began working together in 2012 for the local newspaper, the East Bay Express, and the Alt Weekly newspaper, which is now a shadow of itself, sadly. And we, in putting together our stories and our articles about various scandals that the police department engaged in, the struggle over budgets, violent crime, political control, the back and forth there, we got a broader understanding of this history and realized that there's a deeper story to be told here, because this is the city in the United States that has been under a formal reform program now for the longest period of time of any police department. It's 20 years this month. And that is a remarkable story. And it really calls into question, because of the ins and outs of that story, that those 20 years, those 2 decades, which we can get into later, it calls into the question whether or not the project of reforming law enforcement is feasible.
So we answered the question of where, and we can go to the next questions of when and who about this story in the book. Who are the people that you are focusing on, and when all this stuff happens? Because in the book there is the police group called the Riders, officers named Mabanak, Siapno, Vasquez, Hayter, and others, who committed lots of crimes with impunity starting from the late 90s. These crimes include like brutalizing innocent people, using disproportionate force against suspects, false confession, exonerating the police officers, planting drugs and weapons on suspects and crime scenes, paying informants with drugs and dirty money, even killing pet dogs as sport. Can you tell us more about this group of sadistic and corrupt cops that are featured in your book? And can you also provide some background about the time that this group was active?
Certainly. So I can, I'll start with the second half of that question. The 1980s and 1990s early 1990s were a very difficult time in Oakland. The city went through a very wrenching spell of deindustrialization and white flight in the beginning of the 1970s. There were also changes there was a tax rebellion in California that for American history is actually quite important. It's California is we think of it now as a very liberal place, but actually it's where Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan got their starts politically. And it was a very important place for modern conservatism. It's where the new reactionary right actually first put their social programs into play. Small government, cutting taxes, really getting into a very nativist, hardline social stance on several issues. In the 1990s, there were very, very contentious battles over state propositions to deport migrants and deny social services to undocumented migrants, of which there are millions in the state of California. California, and Oakland in particular, had a very strong drawback of social support, and the urban centers of the state really suffered from a lot of disinvestment. And in this place, when high unemployment comes in, industry goes away, the narcotics trade came in. So in Oakland, we had, there's always kind of been a pretty strong presence of heroin because it's a port city. And during the Vietnam era, that's when really industrial importation of heroin from Southeast Asia started coming in. And it was very apparent on the streets in West Oakland. But in the 80s and 90s, that's when crack cocaine hits the US and causes a full-blown social crisis. And there was a lot of violence that came along with that, because the street product was sold by organized, well-armed drug crews, and they would go after each other for the control of drug territory. And Oakland's violent crime rate was very high. The peak was in 1992, the homicide peak, which is also consistent with the national trend. That's when violent crime in the United States hit its nadir. In the mid to late 1990s, the former governor of California, Jerry Brown, who had been a progressive figure in the 1970s and 80s while he was in control of the state, had been out of politics for maybe 10, 15 years, made his comeback as a left-wing figure seeking to make Oakland into a progressive utopia, this environmental green haven on the shores of the Bay. And by the time he was elected in 1998, and when he got into office, he had turned into a hardcore pro-law enforcement figure who also pushed a very aggressive program of development and gentrification. And he engaged in a type of policing here known as zero tolerance, which is best exemplified by the New York Police Department during the 1990s under Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and a very aggressive cleanup of both public disorder, low-level offenses like drinking on the street, urinating in public, the like, but also rousing homeless people and moving them out of downtown and commercial quarters by whatever means necessary. We also saw a lot of enforcement of low-level narcotics crimes were very aggressively pursued. The idea was to take the corners back from drug dealers and addicts and so on. So this is the atmosphere in which the riders are operating. And they were a group of several officers in West Oakland. The four of whom were formally identified as riders were Chuck Mabanag, Clarence Mabanag, who was a field training officer, Jude Siapno, Matt Hornung, the youngest of them all, a rookie, and by the way, the only white officer, and then Frank Vasquez. Frank Vasquez had the nickname a choker because he was his colleagues knew him to subdue people by grabbing them by the throat and the Adam's apple and squeezing the thorax. He was an extremely aggressive cop. And these officers were popular. They were well liked by their supervisors. They had received departmental commendations because what they did is they got arrests. They hit number targets. They hit the quotas. They cleaned up corners. They took people off the streets. It's how they did it that's the real issue. They would oftentimes plant drugs on people. They would write up false charges, write up false confessions. They would beat people into submission. They oftentimes, if they encountered a dog that was tied up in someone's yard and wanted to, assert their dominance over that person, or they were just in the mood, they'd shoot the dog dead and then cut the rope or chain and then claim the dog was loose and that they had to shoot it because they were in their fear of their life. One of them, Jude Siapno, had the habit of beating. He was known as the foot doctor because he would beat suspects on the soles of their feet so badly that they couldn't walk because of the bruising. They were very, very brutal officers, but they were not exceptional. Their conduct was well known in the department, and there were also quite a number of other officers in West Oakland who tag along with them on certain shifts and knew their conduct. They essentially ran themselves. They weren't supervised. Their sergeant would park his patrol vehicle under a bridge and fall asleep, and they would run themselves. And
there were also good officers who were whistleblowers, like Officer Bater, who were blamed as snitches by all the corrupt cops around. And they are even threatened with that. By the way, after all this stuff happens, one of the officers, Vasquez, still remains at large, a fugitive now, and probably in Mexico. And whistleblowers like Officer Bater are afraid that these corrupt cops can one day come and kill them as well, because some of them are real murderers. What was it like for such whistleblowers to reveal the crimes of his colleagues in such a system that for so many years did not award such whistleblowers but penalize them? And what were some of the failed attempts to reform the police department that you discuss in the book? Sure. How did the politics affect those attempts?
Certainly. So the conduct of the riders came to light not because of a lawsuit or because defense attorneys were pushing back in court and trying to make this conduct known, although that did happen. These officers their conduct was widely known in the legal circles, in the criminal defense circles in Alameda County. The problem is that the prosecutors and judges never pumped the brakes on the cases that these officers brought. They never scrutinized their testimony properly. They just let the conduct go on and turned a blind eye and maybe cut a plea deal for the defendant. But the conduct of Mabanag, Siapno, Vasquez, and Hornung came to light during the summer of 2000 when a young man named Keith Batt, he graduated from the police academy, top of his class, high marks, good marksman, very proficient with a firearm, very intelligent, really had good marks on his tests and was his academy instructors were very positive about him. They said, you have a good career ahead of you. This is going to be good for you. He was assigned during your first 6 months as a police officer, when you're a probationary officer, when you're kind of in your, I guess, apprentice stage out of the academy, he was assigned to train in West Oakland to ride along with Chuck Mabanag as his field training officer. And when he received this assignment, there were a couple cryptic remarks made to him by instructors and other, older officers who he had become friendly with, saying, okay, well, watch out for this guy, just keep your head on a swivel. Made him feel a little bit uncomfortable, but at the same time, these cops did have a reputation as being very active, very aggressive, as producing numbers. So it was theoretically, for a young cop who wants to see action, this is a great place to be. In a little less than 2 weeks on the street in West Oakland with these cops, which is a rough district, there's a lot of narcotics trade that goes on there, high rate of gun violence, mostly African-American neighborhood, although it's become less so over the years. Officer Batt witnessed some horrible things. He witnessed a dog being murdered. He witnessed suspects being choked, people having narcotics evidence planted on them, people being stopped in the street. There was a young man named Delphine Allen who the riders basically kidnapped off a street in West Oakland because he was walking alone at night, and they suspected him of being a drug dealer. They arrested him, planted drugs on him, and then when he talked back, drove him under a bridge in an isolated area of West Oakland and pummeled him into submission. Jude Siapno almost knocked his eye out with an elbow strike. You can see, if there's a photograph we have in the hard copy of the book, where Allen's eye is being shown in court by a prosecutor, photograph of it's being shown, and the eye is just blood red. He had his feet beaten by Siapno as well, so he couldn't walk. Batt witnessed the first half of that beating, not the second half. He witnessed a number of other people, who had full cans of pepper spray emptied into their mouth, drugs planted on them. There's just systematic abuses. When he confronted the riders about this in one meeting, he said, I can't go on with this. This isn't right. And they said, well, you're not going to snitch on us, right? And there's a scene in the book where, he is in a parking garage, outside a parking garage with Vasquez and Mabanag. At one point, while he's speaking with these officers and talking to them about the conduct, he sees the look on Frank Vasquez's face, and this thought runs through his mind. Okay, if this goes bad, can I get my pistol out? Can I take them down fast enough? And if that happens, what's it going to look like if a cop in uniform shoots two other cops in uniform, right? This is the thought process that was happening at the time. But eventually Mabanag convinces him, okay, well, you're not cut out for this. You're going to quit. You're going to write a letter of resignation and say that, hey, listen, I'm not cut out for this. I can't handle it. And he goes in to resign, and while he's in police headquarters, he has this crisis of conscience, and Batt goes upstairs to the Internal Affairs Agency, which is supposedly the cops who are responsible for policing the police, and tells them everything, gives him a full accounting of his weeks on the job and what he's seen. And that immediately turns into a major case against those four officers. They're suspended. There's also a criminal case that is investigated by the DA's office and then charged against those four officers. That's when Frank Vasquez flees the country. He was last seen in a suburb north of Oakland. He was stopped by a police officer with a pistol and a department-issued rifle, an AR-15 rifle, on him that he had seconded. He'd taken from the arsenal of the Oakland Police Department without permission. But he managed to badge his way out of the encounter, which is, hey, I'm a cop, this is what I'm doing out here. And the other officer believed him. And that was the last he's been seen. And this is shortly before the indictment. And he has never been seen since. He is on the wanted list by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the charges that happened in 2000. A long-winded way of saying that this scandal, when it blew up, really tore apart the public image of Jerry Brown's kind of war on crime. The city of Oakland was staring down lawsuits from 119 victims of the rioters that may have bankrupted the city in all likelihood. So instead of actually paying out that money, the city decided they were sued by two civil rights attorneys, John Burris and Jim Channon. And instead of paying out that money, they entered into what's known as a consent decree, which is a process, a formal judicially overseen decree that sets out a reform program for an institution, be it a prison, a school district, a hospital, a police department, that mandates a series of reforms and overhauls to internal practices that lead to the initial abuse. They're bound by this court order. There's a federal judge overseeing it, and the judge hires his own team of monitors who are in place to ensure that this reform program is actually being put into effect. And that was signed in 2003. Consent decrees are the way that the American judicial system and society has decided we can actually affect police reform. Typically, the Department of Justice, the federal Department of Justice, brings consent decrees against police departments that are deemed to have engaged in egregious practices. Several of the departments put under consent decrees include the Los Angeles Police Department, the Chicago Police Department, Seattle, New Orleans, Washington, D.C., Albuquerque, New Mexico, the list goes on, large departments and small. The consent decree in Oakland was not brought by the Department of Justice for a few reasons. Number one, it was at the end of Bill Clinton's second term, and the Justice Department at the time, the personnel there, which typically changes over when a presidential administration changes. Clinton administration people didn't want to take on a new case. And the incoming president, George W. Bush, was a Republican. And as is the evidence in the 25 years since consent decrees for law enforcement have been viable, since they were approved by Congress in 1994, Republican administrations do almost no work on police reform. That's been the case with both terms that W served and the one term that he who shall not be named served just now. Consent decree that OPD is under has now dragged on 20 years. And it's gone this way because during the initial 5 years, first off, the rioters, the dirty cops who were outed by Keith Batt, were never convicted of their crimes. There were two separate trials that resulted in hung juries, and on some charges, there were actually acquittals. So there was no conviction that showed, there was no court of law that said, hey, look, these cops were guilty of their crimes and their misconduct was egregious. In turn, that led to the police department, internal kind of, not the official chief and the kind of department's public facing side, but the department's subculture, the internal culture of the police department. A large segment of the sworn officers viewed the scandal as a fake scandal, and that the officers who had been charged and outed by Keith Batt were just doing their job. They were productive cops. They were good men. They were being ordered to do what they had done by their superiors and politicians, which to a big extent is actually true. However, their acts were deeply egregious, and the repercussions that Keith Batt and a couple other cops who did testify at trial, but none of whom went to the same extent that Batt did in outing the rioters. It was pretty egregious. Batt carried a gun illegally on him during the initial months after he reported the rioters, because the internal affairs investigator who interviewed him said, listen, you should be carrying, even if it's illegal, don't worry about if you get into anything. You want to worry about the problem of having a concealed firearm on you illegally rather than being, 6 feet deep in the dirt, which is a very, grim way to think about it. But that was the reality of what he was living at the time. He was confronted in the months and years to come out at bars and, in public by friends of the rioters, by people who were associated with OPD and, called him a rat to his face. He lived in North Oakland, but had to move almost immediately after word got back to him that a number of cops were talking in the dressing room, were talking in the locker room about going by his house and doing a project, which is, a project is a police term for operation or so on. So Who knows if they were going to shoot up his house or enter in and try and beat him up or whatever have you, but that certainly was enough to get him to leave Oakland for a short period of time. There was a graffiti threatening his life and threatening another officer in OPD's locker room and elsewhere in the bathrooms in police headquarters, on their lockers as well. It was a very fraught thing for him to do, and unfortunately his case is not unique. There's been similar blowback against police whistleblowers down the years in the US. Frank Serpico, an NYPD detective, is a really good example of this. He exposed systematic graft in New York City's police force in the 1970s, and was reassigned and given, basically put on the street as a narcotics detective way below his grade. And then on a call in Brooklyn, he was actually shot in the face and left for dead by a drug dealer, and his partners didn't come and give him backup, and he almost bled out on the stairwell of this building in Williamsburg. So, the consequences for whistleblowers in the US is that they're very, very, very high. And there is such a thing as the thin blue line, or, the code of silence, and the price for breaking that is very high.
So to summarize, what happened to the riders perhaps cannot be described as justice, because there were no convictions, but still they were removed from the force, from the streets, through, for instance, these schemes like consent decree worked in the end. That's why I think, against all odds, you finished the book on a high note, praising the positive outcomes of police reform in Oakland. How can public bodies avoid backsliding? As you note in the conclusion, is the solution outside intervention, like consent decrees? But you also mentioned the importance of continuous protest and obsessive scrutiny of the police.
Mm-hmm. So the consent decree has been an interesting mechanism in Oakland. By some criteria, it has not achieved its goal of kind of checking the boxes. It is a very technical list, of tasks to be performed. There's some 50 odd tasks, and they run from setting up an internal database of potential problem officers to ensuring that there are enough sergeants to properly supervise cops on the street, to ensuring that all internal affairs investigations, all complaints are thoroughly investigated. That's a very wide-ranging list of tasks, but it was initially supposed to last 5 years. During that 5 years, it didn't come out of a desk drawer because there was such opposition to it from the commanders and from the sergeants as well. And there was no political will also on the municipal level to put that into play. And it took a lot of, and there was, the monitors who initially oversaw the consent decree. They actually published throughout the course of this consent decree, they publish reports once every 3 months. So for about 4 reports a year, at least. And they're pretty, the 50, 70 odd reports that have been published since then, actually more than that now. There are dozens. And they're really interesting documents because they track kind of the minute goings on of the police department on the day-to-day and, during these periods of time. But they also provide a holistic view of the department's actual cultural shift. And over time, there were very intense protest movements. The real hinge for Oakland's the police reform program, I believe, and my colleague and I, we both believe that it really began in 2009 when a huge series of protests kicked off in Oakland over the murder of a young man named Oscar Grant on a public transit platform on New Year's Day, 2009. He was killed by a transit officer, not an Oakland police officer, but the protests around that incident focused they didn't just focus on his murder, they expanded to the issue of police brutality and impunity in Oakland and the region at large. And the police department engaged in some really severe repression of that movement. Then a year or two later, the Occupy Oakland movement kicked off, and that was part of the broader national Occupy Wall Street milieu. They were also subjected to extremely violent treatment by police, and the camp was broken up in a militarized manner. I was there for both those movements. and a lot of protests that happened in between. It was a very restive period. So there was the public got a very they got a very in-their-face display of what it looks like when a police department is not accountable and engages in the same practices that they've engaged in for decades. And that led to that resulted in a very sustained push, both in the courts and in City Hall and in the streets, for the police department to reform itself, to abide by the consent decree. I remember seeing signs during, one of these raids on Occupy Oakland, tear gas is flying around, people are choking on this acrid, pepper spray. And this woman standing out there with a sign that said, Judge Thelton Henderson is watching. And Judge Thelton Henderson was the federal judge who oversaw Oakland's consent decree for 15 years and he was presiding at the time. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, they're really paying attention, like that people understand how that this reform program is important. It's the way that they can push the department to change. And down the years, the police department did change. They really overhauled a number of practices, chases, car chases, vehicle chases. Back in the day, there used to be a emphasis in OPD about securing the suspect, about not losing a chase, not letting someone get away. And that resulted in many cases, Oakland would shoot and kill. There'd be about 12 shootings a year involving cops, 12 to 15 shootings. And most of those, the half to 60% of those shootings would be fatal, armed or unarmed suspects. Now it's down because they've revised the chase policy and said you need to break off chases and pursuits until you have enough backup and there's a safe perimeter established. And you can ensure that there won't be any civilians who are killed, whether they're the suspect or or bystanders. Now it's down to about 1 to 3 a year. And that's to say no one should be killed by the police, no matter what they've done. But, everyone has rights, even suspected murderers. But that being said, the change is drastic. The police department also engaged in an effort with Stanford University, because one of the things that they were accused of during the Ryder scandal was racially profiling people and stopping and searching African-American men, predominantly men, but women as well, disproportionately without reasonable suspicion, without legal standing. And with Stanford University, they engaged in a groundbreaking analysis of all their stop data, every single contact that a police officer had with a citizen. You have to write up a form. You have to actually document the contact. And along with professor at Stanford, they analyzed the stop data, broke down and showed, okay, there's a massive racial disparity in terms of Black stopped, Latino stopped, white stopped, and then the actual result of the stop. It turned out that whites stopped by the police even though they were stopped far less frequently, they were often found in violation of the law or in possession of contraband or weapons at a much higher rate. So, there are things that have really changed for the better. That being said, there has been a lot of backsliding. There was actually just yesterday, news broke about an internal affairs investigation that show the police buried 2 misconduct cases against a very popular sergeant because he's hooked in with, essentially because he's popular. He's the head of the Asian American Officers Association. And he's hooked in with a couple very influential, not politicians, but kind of movers and shakers in downtown Oakland. So this year, OPD was about to get out of the consent decree. The judge was about ready to sign off on it being done. This development probably torpedoes that because it shows all the way up the chain to the chief of police that this conduct was known. They didn't deal with this incident appropriately and that they buried misconduct that possibly rose to the level of criminal conduct as well. So there is optimism in here about the ability of citizens to push and make certain that police do police equitably, but there are also limits to what can be done within this system. Those limits are legal limits, and they also are outlined by the existence of the institution itself, which may or may not be savable, but that's not a question that we purport to answer. However, in this community, there has been well over half a century of agitation for equal treatment under the law and for better policing and more equitable policing, if not no policing. And I think that there are lessons to be taken away from this that reach well beyond Oakland.
Now let's talk about these lessons that other cities in the United States and in the world can learn from the successes and failures in Oakland. A participant just asked a question. I'm interested to hear what do you think about police reform and its correlation to level of criminality in other major US cities such as New York. What are the lessons learned? How do issues like homelessness and mental health issues challenge police departments that attend the asks? And I will complete it with another city in the world, for instance, Istanbul, Turkey. As you know, Turkey and Europe very well as well. Police torture has been a problem in Turkey for many decades until the EU reforms in mid-2000s, especially in the 1990s. It was a huge problem. Many human rights activists say that police handling that amounts to torture started again in recent years. Regardless of the debates, disproportionate use of police force in public protests like women's rights marches, like the LGBT events, including the Pride March, continues, and impunity in cases where Turkish police officers commit crimes continue. Sometimes, for instance, two cases are in the minds of the public. In 2013, Berkin Elvan was killed. He was 14 years old. He was shot by a gas canister fired by a police officer, and the police officer received a 16-year sentence, but only in 2021, and his commanding officers were never punished, although they were the ones who ordered these officers to fire this gas canister. Another case was the African immigrant Festus Oke, who was killed over 15 years ago in Taksim, Istanbul, and his killer only got some 3 years long jail sentence just last year. So after 15 years, I think on the fourth of this court cases, he finally was convicted, but very short amount of time in jail. What do you think about both issues, like in New York, homelessness, mental health issues, and in Turkey, always impunity and police brutality?
Certainly. With regard to New York, so that's a great question. I'm a New Yorker. I grew up in the city. I live there now. Homelessness now is a very, very challenging issue. And mental health as well. There is a real national crisis in the United States with regards to unhoused people and mental health, and it overlaps with drug addiction as well. There's a very good book by a California journalist named Sam Quinones called The Least of Us, which I believe it came out in 2001 at first. It's out in paperback now. It traces out the overlapping drug epidemics of fentanyl and methamphetamine addiction, and how both of those drugs, those substances, which they're not like heroin or cocaine or marijuana or psychedelic mushrooms, they're lab drugs, right? They're essentially pharmaceuticals, and they're very potent. They have driven a very large rise in mental illness among drug using populations. At the same time, during the era 1980s, 1970s, 80s, during the kind of conservative resurgence, the United States basically shredded its social safety net for the mentally ill. Mental hospitals were closed around the country. Treatment centers were dealt away with, and the mentally ill were essentially left to their own devices. And in the succeeding years, there's been an urban revival in the U.S. There's a ton of investment in cities and young folks, families want to move back. White folks especially want to move back to the cities and live in an environment that's not so stretched out and automobile centric. So cities, basically starting with New York in the early 1990s, and you can kind of see the developments all around the country, have built a lot of market rate housing, have stripped off a lot of the affordable housing supply. There's been various attempts to gut rent stabilization laws and other measures that provide a stock of affordable housing that keep that stable. And as a result, the cost of living, the cost of housing has tremendously increased. In Oakland, I think it's gone up maybe about 130 to 150% in 10 years. I would estimate that that's a pretty decent increase in rent. So in 2010, the average rent was around $1,500 for a 2-bedroom. Now you'd be lucky to get that for $3,000. And that's per month. So there's been a kind of two parallel crises that do intersect, but that push a lot of people out from stable housing and stable occupations too. We had a massive recession in 2009, 10, 2007 through 2009 that put a lot of people out of work and out of stable work. And there's a big rise in temporary work. So all these people are put out onto the street, and law enforcement, unfortunately, in the US is kind of the Swiss Army knife that we use to address a litany of problems. And it's quite ironic because the institution, and we show this in our book, was initially founded to protect private property and the existing social order, and also keep restive populations in line, be it in Oakland, the Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, labor radicals in the early 20th century, the African-American population and student radicals in the mid 20th century, or now, Occupy Wall Street, Oscar Grant protesters, so be it. Crime control actually comes about as a kind of underpinning reason for law enforcement's existence and their main function in the mid 20th century. Once you start seeing this kind of breakdown of social order during the offshoring of industry, during the kind of shift away from cities into the suburbs, and the crime rate in the US really is the drastic increase in the crime rate is a relatively recent phenomenon in the long view. The problem with using law enforcement to address things beyond their training, it's a coercive, repressive arm of the state. It is, they are trained to control people, to subdue people, to secure them into custody. They are not social workers, and trying to use an institution that's trained to do that very hard-edged work, to do something as complex and nuanced and frankly fraught as social work and intervention with very at-risk populations and people who are in deep distress, is really difficult. I don't think I'm the first or last journalist to make this observation. David Simon, a very, very well-known journalist who wrote books like Homicide and The Corner, and also created The Wire, a brilliant television series that is a very cutting look at law enforcement, American law enforcement and society, really makes this clear that the police are being too much is placed on their brief. They have far too many responsibilities that exceed their capacities, both as individuals and as an institution. So I think that the real reform that has to happen there is that the state has to use other tools to address those issues. There has to be a creation of affordable housing. There have to be more intervention programs, non-coercive intervention programs for narcotics users and addicts and homeless folks and people who are in severe mental distress. Like, there needs to be more of a treatment element to this. It needs to be addressed as public health matters, and also as a social stability matter. That's a long-winded way of answering that question. With regard to places like Turkey, where the police are not as broken up in local, in the US, policing and law enforcement in the US is balkanized. Every city has their own police department. There are county sheriffs, there's state law enforcement, there's the FBI, there's the Drug Enforcement Administration, there's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It's federal. We're in a federal system, so it's not each state, it's multipolar. In places like Turkey, and I believe France as well, the police are basically run out of either Ankara or Paris. It's centralized. Am I right, Emre? Great.
Correct.
Good. So that makes accountability much more difficult because the weight of control you need to put in order to change police at a local level, you can put pressure at an actor that has less influence and pull in a system, and you can push on it from multiple sides. Doing that with someone like the interior minister is much harder, or the head of the national police is much more difficult, or the gendarme, for instance, which is military police. And in a situation where you still have existing decrees of emergency, I believe the decree of emergency from 2016 is still active in Turkey. Is that right? That makes it all the more difficult, because even though the immediate threat may have passed, those extraordinary powers granted to the state and the curtailing of the ability to criticize the government and all these various coercive means that the Turkish government has put in place to control not only formal media, like the newspapers and the television stations, but also social media as well, the platforms that have actually served as really critical conduits of information and independent reporting in Turkey in a way that I don't think we can fully appreciate in the United States, because of our differing press regimes and free speech laws. I think that the only way you really change those is with a change in government. And I think that the ways in which Berkin Elvan's case is representative of how hard it is to get justice just in merely one instance that was quite egregious. And frankly, for the Turkish courts to give this officer a 16-year sentence for killing a young boy with a tear gas canister. I mean, by contrast, Oscar Grant's killer, who shot him in the back as he's handcuffed on a train platform on video with an actual pistol, he got 4 years, something like that, or maybe 3 years plus time served. So he was out of prison. He was out of correctional facilities, I believe, in less than a year after that trial was concluded. So it is, Berkin Elvan's case shows that there's an ability for public pressure to get consequences, but it takes an incredibly long time. It may yet be thwarted. And I honestly think that in systems where where power is so centralized, that means that the actual government has to flip over before you can even consider changing regimes one way or the other. It will take probably amendments to the constitution or the Turkish system of policing for that power to be kind of watered down and broken up a little bit, and for more accountability to come in on a local level. But it's a very daunting prospect.
And as we approach the end of this session, we have just 3 minutes left, and we have so many questions, but I will just ask one question from the participants. An attendee asks, first praises your perfectly executed storytelling in the book. Beside the facts, it's really a good storytelling there. And asking, what I'm curious is, how did you do as co-writers handle the storytelling part of the book? Wasn't it hard to put together all this harrowing material, not only in a coherent whole, but also in an enticing, interesting reading text? And I will also just like last 2 minutes, I will also add one of my remaining questions. What advice do you have for aspiring journalists, aspiring investigative journalists who may conduct such a research in a long term?
Certainly. Thank you for the questions. I think that we'd worked together for about roughly a decade before we engaged in this project. And Darwin and I have a very fluid working relationship. We understand each other's trains of thoughts. We are very rigorous in terms of outlining our structure for longer articles. For this book, we actually had a very substantial working outline that we would go into and figure out where the different parts needed to be and move around for our chapters and for our storytelling, and to make certain that the narrative made sense. We thought that starting with the story of why Oakland got into oversight was really important. And it was also very gripping because we had this material from Keith Batt's weeks on the jobs and the dramatic trials and the oversight processes and the investigations that went on. That was a good hook to draw readers in. But our intent was always to write out a history of the city, a la Mike Davis's City of Courts about Los Angeles, another brilliant book that I recommend for everyone. And that was a model for us. And we believe that that broader sweep of history both gives you a sense of place, which is really important for making readers understand, for bringing them into the story, investing them in the characters, in the community, and also not making it dry. Our whole point was to try and put you in Oakland. We tried to give descriptions of the weather. We tried to give descriptions of music. We tried to lay out, ways in which neighborhood fabrics change. We tried to give you, depict what the neighborhood looked like, what these little shotgun shacks, these stucco bungalows that were thrown up in the 1940s and 50s looked like. But this also drew, and this is to get to your question, Emre, this also drew on 15 years of reporting on my part, about 10, 12 on Darwin's part, in Oakland, on many, many incidents and, institutions that we were extremely familiar with. So we went back to our notes. We really poured over our contacts. We re-interviewed people. We found people we hadn't interviewed beforehand. We sued the city of Oakland for hundreds of thousands of records and won them through our state's open record law, through California's open record laws. And that, it is investigative history. I mean, it's journalism, but it's also history, because we went and mined periodical archives and primary sources as well. We really worked to try and build out as complete a picture of the city as possible and to surround the subject. That's the best advice I can possibly give to young reporters. Be there, be on the ground, show up on time, show up early. It's important to be at a location instead of interpreting the world through a computer screen, which during the pandemic era is very difficult to not do that. But nothing beats actually being somewhere on the ground and really understanding the city and people that you're reporting on and communicating with. Also, it's important. There are two basic things about interviewing and interacting with people. Always ask questions. There's no such thing as a stupid question. Don't assume you know everything. Don't try and talk past somebody. You're supposed to be a receiver for information, then you filter it after the fact, right? Also, when I learned this while working for a radio station in San Francisco, it was a technical thing, but it actually applies for broader conversations and a broader approach to reporting. It's important when you ask a question to then shut up and listen, because in a technical sense, if you're recording somebody and you talk over them, you ruin your tape, right? So it's important to preserve your tape. But then if you let someone talk, and you let them kind of go with their thoughts, they might take you in a direction for that conversation that you didn't expect. They won't give you a canned quote. They won't give you a bromide. They might give you a really cutting insight and then take you on a different track of conversation or tell you a different story that you didn't expect them to do. And it also opened them up. So those are a couple very quick and dirty answers for best things that young reporters can do. Also, local journalism, don't look down on it. Really, I think that there's a big trend now for people to say, and there always was, for people to shoot high and say, I want to work for the New York Times. I want to work for the Washington Post, blah, blah, blah. I worked for the New York Times. It was not a good place to work. And the journalism that happened there, honestly, the local journalism that you see from outlets around the country makes the New York Times able to do the work that they do. They've actually built their stuff on the blocks, on the shoulders of local reporters around the country. The size of the outlet, the prestige that it has, that's not really what matters. What matters is the end product and the work that you do.
Ali, thank you very much for this great conversation and for your great book, incredible book. I recommend everyone to read The Riders Come Out at Night. And I also would like to thank to all the participants and also for Columbia Global Centers Istanbul for this invitation. I hope to see all of you in another panel.
Çok sağ olun.